Basically, just to kind of get started, this is the third time I've done some semblance of a presentation on the CFR and their coverage of COVID. So some of you may have heard what I've already presented. So I'm only going to spend a couple minutes rehashing that just so we can make this kind of a definitive presentation. But most of my time is going to be spent covering things that I haven't yet talked about. Um, a Not a problem, but I suppose a persistent challenge with covering something like foreign affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations coverage of any global issue is just that they have so many people working for them that they're putting out so much content that it's not impossible, but highly improbable for one person to be able to keep up with all of it. So yesterday, I looked at how many articles they had posted since the last time I had done a presentation, and it was 6. And just since yesterday now, they've posted 4 more. So I haven't read all of the new articles, and I don't think moving forward I'll be able to read every single one. However, I do want to keep my finger to the pulse as best I can. But just everybody be aware that I'm not presenting or claiming to present a definitive uh, analysis of their coverage of COVID. I'm only instead trying to point you to some of the larger narratives that seem to run through a multiplicity of the articles that I've read. And luckily, everything that I've seen and that I'm presenting is freely available online. So, if there's a specific aspect of any of this that you're interested in, it's right there for you to check out and dig into on your own. And if you disagree with my analysis or think I'm missing something, then that's great. We can have a conversation, and the resources are all available. So, with that being said, I'm going to sum up just very briefly what I talked about the past couple of times. This is going to be referring to the first 7 or 8 articles that they've published actually. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's just make sure that actually works. Okay. So these are all of the articles as of today. So they go back to September, October of 2019, just referring to the general possibility of a global pandemic. They're interviewing the Director General of the World Health Organization, and he's basically just talking about his number one fear is an impending pandemic, that the world is grossly underprepared for it. And, things that you would expect to hear from somebody in that position when he's spending all of his time focusing on world health. Naturally, he's going to find his boogeyman in the form of some sort of world health issue. But that's more general. And the articles that follow this one, having to do with the specific coronavirus that we're dealing with now, they're all just acknowledging that, it's hit China. It's not something that we really know how to deal with. And this specific article from January 31st, which is entitled How to Prepare for a Coronavirus Pandemic. So that's about a month and a half before it was actually declared a pandemic. They're already recommending that we get ready for it to become one. They say that developing a vaccine is a top priority, and a number of countries, companies, and international organizations have already started this work. They note that a vaccine would take around a year to develop. However, to speed up that time, they highly recommend that it become a sort of multinational project. There's another article in here that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes that refers to the necessity of basically instituting a new kind of vaccination Manhattan project in regards to combating the COVID outbreak. But all of the articles really up until March the 5th are just sort of skimming the surface of the existence of a pandemic, talking about China and how they're dealing with it. Though one, I would say the most important little factoid that comes out of these earlier sort of preparatory articles is in that, let's see, it's the article from March 3rd. Not this one, but this will help me get to it. Okay. Pandemic disease is a threat to national security. This is written by a guy, C.S. Muncy, and it opens up by saying, quote, on January 13th, 2017, national security officials assembled in the White House to chart a response to a global pandemic. A new virus was spreading with alarming speed, causing global transportation stoppages, supply chain disruptions, and plunging stock market prices. With a vaccine many months away, U.S. healthcare infrastructure was severely strained. No, I didn't get that date wrong. This happened. It was part of a transition exercise that outgoing officials from the administration of President Barack Obama convened for the benefit of the incoming team of President Donald Trump. As Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama, I led the exercise, in which my colleagues and I sat side by side with the incoming national security team to discuss the most pressing Homeland Security concerns they would face. Obama and Vice President Joseph Biden made ensuring a professional transition a top priority, so we followed the excellent example of our predecessors, who held a similar exercise in 2009. After 9/11, congressional legislation mandated such efforts in order to safeguard the country's security through presidential transitions. And the article goes on to state that a specific pandemic exercise is not included in that legislation, yet they thought that the possibility of an impending pandemic was so likely that they voluntarily decided to include that in their drill. The reason I take the extra time to point this out is just to demonstrate to everybody that Event 201 wasn't the only preparatory event having to deal with a viral outbreak. It doesn't say here that it was specifically about a coronavirus, but nonetheless, I think that's rather telling that this is something that's been on a lot of people's minds for a long time. And this is, again, coming from the former head of Homeland Security and the counterterrorism advisor to Barack Obama. So that's somebody who would be in a position to organize on many levels. And finally, the article that I say sort of opens the door to the meat of the coverage that the CFR has been doing is this one from March 5th. And it's entitled U.S.-Chinese Distrust is Inviting Dangerous Coronavirus Conspiracy Theories. Now, I talked a little bit about this one on Friday night's town hall, so I'm not going to dig into it as much as I did then. But just to suffice it to say, the general thrust of the argument is that the United States and China don't trust each other. And while they don't trust each other, they simultaneously have no motivation to develop weapons to use against one another, so it says in here. However, it also acknowledges that in the past there has been incentive to develop biological weapons, which led to the creation of the Biological Weapons Convention, or BWC, in 1969, which went into effect legally in 1975. Quote, this treaty prohibits the development, production, and stockpiling of biological agents and related delivery systems intended for hostile use, unquote. So there's an international policy in place barring the use of biological weapons. However, the article makes it a point to say that neither the US nor China have any incentive to create biological weapons against each other. The article then goes on to say they both still look upon each other with suspicion, and China continued to possess, quote, an offensive biological warfare capability based on technology developed prior to its ascension to the BWC. That's the commission that I mentioned just a minute ago. So I want you to think about that. This article is presenting information coming from the US Department of Defense that China, I'll just read you the quote. According to a former official from the US Department of Defense, by the 1990s, China had manufactured and weaponized a wide variety of infectious microorganisms and toxins and had a wide range of delivery means available, including ballistic and cruise missiles. All right. Official Chinese, I'm continuing quoting just a couple sentences later. Official Chinese publications do suggest sustained and organized biowarfare-related research activity. At another point in the article, just another paragraph down, now talking about how the Chinese think about the Americans and their bioweapons capabilities, quote, quote, Chinese military researchers published an article accusing the United States of using new technologies to develop novel biological weapons agents and claiming it was extremely likely that anthrax spores in the 2001 attacks on Democratic senators' offices came from U.S. military labs. That's just a little bit about how this article gets into what I think is a rather absurd dismissal of the possibility of any alternative narrative other than the official one. It mentions how the lab that is at Wuhan, one of the doctors there specifically was pursuing the novel coronavirus in the months preceding the outbreak. It also mentions that the director of that very same lab may or may not have been selling test animals illegally for his own profit on the market in China, in Wuhan. So, nonetheless, after presenting all of this rather sketchy information, the author of this article brushes it all aside and saying, look, any alternative narrative to the idea that this purely happened by accident is only going to harm international cooperation. If we want to get this thing past us, then what we're going to have to do is work together. The US, China, one world together. And floating conspiracy theories accusing one side or the other is only going to get in the way of that. So to me, and maybe I'm being naive here, but I think that perhaps the situation would be served better by truthful investigation and not just accepting whatever narrative seems to be um, efficacious, or, well, efficacious is probably the wrong word, expedient. It's certainly expedient to say, yeah, it's not your fault, it's not our fault, but I think investigating the causes of some sort of global outbreak is probably pretty important and going to bear on how we wind up solving it. For example, if it is something seriously wrong with the Chinese biolab research, and what are their security protocols, what's their vetting process for hiring a director who's going to sell the product on the street illegally, that's something that needs to be addressed if we want to avoid a problem like this in the future. So, as I say, that's the article where I think it all begins to get really interesting. From there, this article is followed up with one from March the 10th called "Science Can't Save Us from Coronavirus Panic, but Trump's information crackdown can certainly make things worse." Now, you know, this this is going to introduce a theme that's common in a lot of these articles, which is we're not so much concerned about truth here at the CFR. We're more concerned about narrative. How are the optics going to make the United States appear? How are they going to make China appear? So this article opens up by mentioning how ever since the progressive era, science and transparency have alleviated anxiety when it comes to public stress and large events. So they mention how from the period around 1890 through World War I, when germ theory took hold and began to transform public health, medical care, and expectations about disease control, this new confidence was in part justified. Health departments made real progress against the threat of contagious diseases during these years. Before, skipping ahead just a minute or a sentence, before 1880, we knew nothing. After 1890, we knew it all. It was a glorious 10 years. So, obviously, they're referring to the fact that the more one knows, the more likely one is able to remain calm in the fate of the problem and also deal with that problem more efficaciously. This is true. This is something that we all understand. And just continuing further with that logic, the article says, quote, "The sociologist Robert E. Park, writing in 1904, made the case for a, quote, new method of communication, unquote, relying on, quote, the power of facts, unquote, which could, when disseminated, transform a frenzied mob into a trusting, compliant public." Now, that's reminiscent of our old friend Edward Bernays, I think. However, from looking just a little bit at Robert E. Park, um, I don't think that his goals were as nefarious as someone like Bernays, and I think that what he's communicating, at least in this quote, is true. It is the case, I think, anyway, that if we can operate on a fact basis, then we're probably more likely to remain calm, not to panic, and I wouldn't use the words trusting or compliant. I would say something more like competent and, well, to use the word again, efficacious. People would be more willing and able to confront a problem if they had more information about it. So again, okay, so here's a good article starting with some, I would say, some truisms. However, as we move on, we find that, of course, it's just a big commercial for good government and a sort of global system that's got well managed optics. So it talks a lot about how in the past there have been epidemics that governments have created various federal and statewide boards for, and how we're going to need this sort of same thing in this pandemic. Basically, we're going to need a whole new federal infrastructure specifically designed to deal with pandemics. And of course, we've already got this sort of thing with the CDC and other organizations. However, as many people in here are probably aware, those were some of the things that Trump did cut. But that doesn't even really come up in this particular article. More or less, the concern is about creating a task force permanently within the federal government in order to deal with any sort of health outbreak. And this underlies every single article that I'll be covering. The most important thing is the narrative. It's not even so much about presenting a solution to the pandemic as it is about making sure that we're all on the same page, that nobody's blaming the wrong person, and that everybody understands that this is going to be an opportunity for the ultimate global system to be tested. And as we'll see in one of the final articles I'm going to talk about in just a minute, this is really sort of the christening moment for the 21st century's global society. That's the narrative being presented in these articles. So I'm going to skip ahead now to one from March the 16th, entitled, "Will the Coronavirus End Globalization as We Know It?" So up to this point, we've been confronted with the pandemic. We understand that it's been growing and growing. At this point, there had already been multiple deaths in the United States, and it has spread to multiple states. And so the CFR has told us that we've got a pandemic, that we need to have the proper narrative being spread about that pandemic, and finally, that we need to develop permanent governmental institutions to deal with this pandemic and future ones. This article opens up by saying that a major reevaluation of the interconnected global economy is at hand. Deep interdependence between firms and nations that makes them more vulnerable to unexpected shocks is now in question. So these are sort of the fundamentals of what globalism is. I would sum it up by evoking the law of entropy, which is that the more complicated a system becomes, or in other words, the more dependent nodes in systems become on other nodes, the more likely it is to break down. And that's simply because if one crucial connection fails, or if multiple crucial connection fails, then the entire system structure is at risk. So I think that this article does a pretty decent job of pointing out that fact of globalism. What annoys me about this article and ones to follow it is they're talking about this gigantic weakness in the philosophy of globalism as if it's surprising, as if no one had thought about this, as if nobody could have seen this sort of thing coming. Yet, I mean, I I could have told you that years ago, and I think most of the people in this room could have identified that sort of thinking as a very obvious, glaring problem with globalism and why it's something to be avoided. Because when everything is interconnected, when you create this system where everybody's dependent on everybody else, if one system goes down, then the entirety of the structure is at risk. So that's essentially what this article is about. It's talking about how it's exposing the fragility of the globalized system. In the age of globalizations, many businesses subscribe to Apple CEO Tim Cook's famous dictum that inventory is fundamentally evil. So they're talking about how much of the global economy relies on the sort of Amazon Prime 2-day shipping business model where now we don't have supply in our warehouse, we just have it delivered on time. Well, when the supply chains are breaking down, that's not a very feasible model. And apparently these business geniuses are just are having to learn it the hard way, even though I think a lot of us could have probably warned them of such things from the very beginning. Um, Nonetheless, the economy is tanking. This article mentions, quote, global production of laptops fell as much as 50% in February, and production of smartphones could fall by 12% this coming quarter. Now, those are some pretty staggering numbers, I think. However, I'm sure that once this blows over, if it does, we'll see those numbers begin to rise back up. But at least with the smartphones, anyway. But they even mention, and I think this is important, and this will lead us into the next articles, and we're continuing with the narrative in those. This is a good kind of linchpin between the sort of disorganized frenzy described in the previous articles and a more organized narrative to follow. Uh, because of this interdependence that many of the Western globalized countries have subscribed to, they are, quote, running low or out of stock of some of the most important elements, not only of the tests to test for the coronavirus, but also things like masks. And I know our news over here in the West has been full of information about we don't have enough masks, we're grossly undersupplied, et cetera, et cetera. The reason they bring this up is, of course, to point out that while even the EU was incapable of delivering adequate amount of material to Italy, China was able to do so. So China had actually supplied a lot of medical material to Italy. And at the point of this article, it even says, quote, to add insult to injury, the United States may soon find itself receiving Chinese charity. The billionaire co-founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, has offered to donate 500,000 kits and 1 million masks. So I don't know if that's still the case, but at the point of this article, that was something that was on the table. So this article, again, has now brought China into the conversation as the nation that's taking the lead while other organizations internationally are failing to do so. The next article, I think, is maybe the most important one. At least it's the one that I've spent the most time looking at and highlighting. And it is from March 18th. The coronavirus could reshape global order. China is maneuvering for international leadership as the United States falters. Now, as I say, this is a very important article, and I really recommend that everybody go check it out. Just because there's so much in here, I would I'd have to just read the entire thing aloud to you to really capture everything that's in it. But this, to try and sum it up anyway, this article says that the United States at this point might be having what it calls a Suez moment, which is what they describe as the event that sort of put the British Empire on the downward spiral, right? So this is the event globally that knocked the British Empire off of its pedestal and into a sort of second-rate position. So the argument in this article goes. And it's saying that the United States is enduring something very similar right now, unless we do something very quickly to change our global position. So it says that the coronavirus is testing the United States, well, let's see, I'll just quote it here. Quote, the status of the United States as a global leader over the past 7 decades has been built not just on wealth and power, but also, and just as important, on the legitimacy that flows from the United States domestic governance, provision of global public goods, and ability and willingness to muster and coordinate a global response to crises. The coronavirus pandemic is testing all 3 elements of U.S. leadership. So far, Washington is failing the test. As Washington falters, Beijing is moving quickly and adeptly to take advantage of the opening created by U.S. mistakes, filling the vacuum to position itself as the global leader in pandemic response. Unquote. This is the direction that most of the articles in Foreign Affairs are going to be taking, thus from this point forward. How is China becoming the global leader in dealing with this pandemic? Now, they do make a point to mention that China is in large part to blame for the spread of this virus globally, as for a while in the beginning, as you'll recall, the government in China was denying the extent of the disease. I know at one point they even denied that it was animal to human human to human transmissible. So at least the way this article presents it, They make it appear as if China now is kind of trying to retrospectively do some damage control and make up for that lost time and make up for that bad image they got by supplying medicine and masks to the world. So, in fact, this article refers to the whole event as China's Chernobyl, and they're doing what they can to stem the tide of the growing coronavirus while also sort of painting themselves in a positive light globally. Uh, what it also makes a point to mention, which is something that I have been concerned about, although I hadn't heard really mentioned in mainstream media all that much, were the, quote, continuing questions over the accuracy of China's statistics. Of course, we're all hearing about how Chinese disease numbers are dropping, how the death rates are down, and hopefully that's true. But I'm not going to be putting all of my money on numbers coming out of China. I think that there is some historical precedent to doubt any statistics from any organization, specifically those that come from an authoritarian police state. But like I said, hopefully those numbers are accurate or relatively accurate. To continue with the article itself, however, it makes mention of how the Chinese are specifically attacking the United States, verbally, rhetorically, saying that the US has had a dismal response to this virus. And it really appears to be the case that the Chinese are positioning themselves to be the new policemen of the world. I don't know if there's a Latin word for Chinese, but it'd be a Pax China something that they're going for. However, the mentions in a typical West fashion, it makes a point to point out that, our system over here of soft power is superior to the Chinese system of hard power. And it says that the authoritarianism of the Chinese has damaged its global appearance, despite the fact that it is, in fact, supplying material to the world. So one important piece of information in here is that China produces the vast majority of active pharmaceutical ingredients necessary to make antibiotics, specifically antibiotics that are crucial for addressing the emergent secondary infections from COVID-19. So I think it was Rich the other day mentioning how the Chinese were threatening to let the United States loose to the hell of coronavirus. And they certainly could do that if they decided to withhold the ingredients to important antibiotics and other medicines. So China is positioning itself as a new global leader in more ways than just the rhetorical. If they're holding important medical material hostage, as it were, that could be a real problem globally, and it could create a system of dependence on China, much like other countries have been dependent on imperial metropolis in the past. So that'd be something for all of us to watch out for, and as far as we can be self-sustainable, we should be. This is the article that mentions the Medical Manhattan Project. Quote, the U.S. government can help by providing incentives to U.S. labs and companies to undertake a medical Manhattan project to devise, rapidly test in clinical trials, and mass produce a vaccine. Of course, it's only a matter of time until that word vaccine popped up, and here it is, March the 18th. So, again, this article closes up after presenting us with so I think a lot of this is good information. However, it's all leading to a point in the narrative. And what is that point? It's that Washington and Beijing could do together what Washington and Beijing could do together for the world's benefit. They need to coordinate a vaccine, they need to coordinate the clinical trials, and they need to work together financially. This, I think, is all about the narrative of globalism. That the United States and that China should not view themselves as isolated or semi-isolated national entities. Instead, we should all be working together on Team Earth, and any alternative narrative that contradicts the idea that animals gave rise to this virus and then it jumped to human beings purely by accident, despite all the accidental evidence to the contrary provided in that March the 5th article, any other narrative is only going to do damage to this global endeavor. That's the drive of this article. That's the drive of all of the articles, in my opinion. Again, I exhort everybody to read them. on their own and come to your own conclusion, but that's really what I'm seeing running through all of these. It's about a coordinated global response based on a narrative that, as far as I'm concerned, is not based on conclusively proven truth. That is where the virus came from. It's based on conjecture and convenient um, acquiescence to a story. But I'm no scientist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I could be wrong, but I think there are a lot of questions to be asked about this virus's origins that these articles are all waving away as if they're nothing. Um, I'm going to wind up the coverage of these articles just because, as I they keep coming out. There are a number of there are four more that I've got notes on, but I don't want to go through all four because I've already taken up a half hour, and I want to give everybody a chance to chat about this and really talk about what it means to them. So, just real quick, this article from March the 19th is entitled "The Real Pandemic Danger is Social Collapse." This is I don't want to call it fear mongering, but it's presenting the possibility that the impact of this virus could in fact lead to global economic collapse. And I love this article, A, because it's short, and B, because it says, quote, "The world faces the prospect of a profound shift, a return to natural, which is to say, self-sufficient economy. That shift is the very opposite of globalization. While globalization entails a division of labor among disparate economies, a return to natural economy means that nations would move towards self-sufficiency. That movement is not inevitable. If national governments can control or overcome the current crisis within the next 6 months or year, the world would likely return to the path of globalization, even if some of the assumptions that undergird it, for example, very taut production chains with just-in-time deliveries, might have to be revised." Okay, so did you catch that? A problem that this virus is unleashing on the world is that local economies have to be local, that the natural way of doing things, that is being self-sufficient, having what you need where you need it, because you're fostering a healthy and well-rounded environment in your physical location, that's the opposite of globalization. But hopefully, luckily, it's not too late. We can turn the tide away from that disgusting, horrible, self-sufficient economic model and return to globalism if we're lucky and if we continue along the same narrative that's been being pushed in these past few articles. And of course, it does the obligatory comparison to the end of Rome and, oh, this is what we're going through now, and we need to centralize the empire further, or else the whole thing is just going to break apart, and you're going to have little communities here and there of self-sufficient peasants, and how awful would that be? Um, it even admits, quote, "The less you need others, the safer and better off you are. Everything that used to be an advantage in a heavily specialized economy now becomes a disadvantage, and the reverse." So, uh, discovering exactly what this author's proclivity is toward is kind of difficult and at least not exactly clear from this article, but I get a kick out of just seeing the flagrant admission in this magazine that a self-sufficient economy, one where one that is more receptive to a sudden catastrophe such as a pandemic, is the opposite to globalization. This goes back to that article I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, how the more complex a system is, the more fragile it is, the easier it is to blow apart because there are more moving parts. Any system with more moving parts is more susceptible to rust, to degradation, to et cetera, et cetera. This is just inherent within the structure of globalization. And this author here sees that, but it looks like he views it as a sort of negative thing. Yes, a self-sufficient economy is better at dealing with catastrophes because not everybody's connected simultaneously. Yes, it is better at dealing with it because it isolates populations more easily and it makes sure that everybody's got the adequate resources they need, um, based on what they've got in their physical proximity. But that's the opposite of globalization, and it's written as if that's a very unfortunate thing. The author wants to get back to globalization. And interestingly enough, China doesn't really play much of a part in this article. It's just more about globalization in general and how the real danger of the coronavirus is globalism collapsing. And hopefully, the United States will be able to return to its position at the top of the global hierarchy and lead us out of this coronavirus panic into the sunset, and we can have a nice American world order again. So I think I'll conclude coverage with, I think it's a good note to end on. But as I say, there's so much more in each and every one of these articles. As you can tell, I'm talking fast and jumping around. Just it's because there is a lot in here, and there's really something worth covering in every single article, in every paragraph. So I really recommend that everybody check it out. The link, they have conveniently put together a database, if you will, of all of their articles that they update every day. So I'll put that once again in the Discord chat. It's just a nice, easy blog post, and you can find everything they've written on the coronavirus. You'll find stuff going back to September all the way up to today. So I'll put that up in the Discord chat once we're through here. In the meantime, if anybody would like to comment or ask any questions or want me to pull up another quote or something specific that maybe I ran through too quickly, by all means, I'm going to unshare my screen and we could all start talking about the implications of this narrative and what it means for the future of the pandemic and for globalization in general. So thank you all for joining me.
If we gave out grades in this course, you would get an A+.
Rock and roll.
That was it could have gone longer. You could have covered those other articles because I was enthralled and I was very pleased to see information that I was like, I understand what this guy's laying out and I understand how to follow you through that crazy diagram you got going on there. So very well composed, and the time, attention, energy, effort that you put into this presentation is appreciated.
Well, I appreciate your kind words, and I would be glad to have another presentation in the future where I can discuss the rest of the articles. Like I said, there's going to be more, so there's more to cover. So I'd be glad to do another one.
Put that on your schedule.
For sure.
Cool. Yeah, no, this is incredibly well done. Thank you very much for taking the time to go through that.
Absolutely. I appreciate you guys' kind words.
Hey, Daniel. I just want to say I'm really looking forward to sharing that last article with my father, because one of the first things he started to talk about was how the Americans need to start bringing that production back. So I already know that there's people out there thinking about how we need to be self-sufficient in our economy. So that is interesting. And I think he's going to find it interesting too, that there's people out there who think that that isn't a good thing.
Well, and not for nothing, but that last article, that proves the point we've been saying for 15 years. They are globalists. They are trying to do this thing, and they just admitted in that article it's not so good, is it? But maybe we're going to continue doing it anyway, because that's who pays that guy's paycheck.
Yeah, I mean, some part of me thinks it's all pre-planned in a certain way. Maybe getting too conspiratorial with it, but a buddy of mine sent me, and I'm going to have to post this in the Discord chat, let me go back to this real quick. It's sort of a timeline of what this man went through when he flew into Shanghai very recently and what you can expect. And so the article that caught my attention the most was the one, "The Coronavirus Could Reshape Global Order." I actually found this article a week ago or so, because I was shocked when I read this myself, and I actually did go through this one. And I'm glad you actually pointed that out. Just like how important this particular article was, because to me it's almost as if, yeah, we admit China screwed up here, but look at how they're maneuvering to deal with the pandemic. So this timeline on this as a Twitter feed here that I'm going to share shows picture by picture of what you can expect, and this is what China is doing to their own population right now, according to this one man's viewpoint. And it's very interesting because it's literally the technocratic playbook. They're rolling out extreme technology measures in order to control their population, to control the virus, from having robots deliver your food in apartment complexes to whole 30-man team squads when you come into their airports, doing testing and all this, the QR codes, to make sure the thermal scanners, like they're almost praising China, even though they started, or one could argue it's all started within China, praising China for their response to it by utilizing technology to have a certain amount of control over the citizenry, which to me, that was just shocking. And I actually posted this to my personal friends because it was a buddy of mine who works.
No, you're right. You're right. And
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And it's worse than that article probably says, because Jack Ma, who's the Bill Gates of China, he runs Alibaba. He's spearheading social credit scores before this even went on.
Right.
Now he's stepping up and he's providing aid, but he is also the hub for anyone to leave their house. So like in Italy, you need a letter from the government to go outside and get groceries or to be outside, right? In China, you need permission from Alibaba, which is the Chinese Amazon.
Yeah.
So they are ramping up the, and the reference, if you want to learn about the Chinese credit system or social credit system, the documentary is called No Dark Corner. It's by ABC Australia, and it should still be on YouTube. And just watching that before the coronavirus panic gave me chills, because I'm like, this is exactly what they're bringing here. Yes. And now they're just expediting it, and it's Trojan horsed.
Yeah, it's all Trojan horse. That's correct. And the fact that the foreign affairs, I mean, they want a sort of global communism is really what they want. And China is the localized model for that, in my opinion. So when I read that the coronavirus could reshape global order, I tried to look up who Kurt Emmett Campbell was, and he must have been some diplomat with China and America, or with, I don't know if it was China specifically or other Asian nations. So he has an interesting past in himself. That was late night research. I don't unfortunately remember much of it. But just doing the who on who Kurt M. Campbell was is sort of interesting in and of itself, the author of that particular article. But it just caught me by surprise, because this Hansen who said left Bangalore last night and just landed in Shanghai today afternoon. I'm surprised by how Pudong Airport and this metro city has been running under the COVID-19 challenge. Here are some of my observations, and keywords are color card, QR code, and self-protection. People wearing gauze, full masks. The QR code also gives information as to whether or not they've been vaccinated, which they have a forced vaccination policy that went in effect in China on December 1st of 2019. So there's all these layers, and he shows a robot delivering his food up to the hotel or apartment complex he was staying at during his stay in China very recently. All these measures they want to roll out, and it's just interesting because we could argue about the U.S. response one way or the other, but it probably hasn't been quite the narrative that this article says it has been. Is that this incompetent? I don't know. I mean, we could go back and forth a little bit with that, but China was also incredibly incompetent. So the fact they admit that, but then are praising China as stepping in. And what do we all forget in this? This is maybe the most important point, and I'll let other people comment on this, but there were 2 to 3 million people protesting in Hong Kong before all this happened against the CCP. And then all of a sudden, there's this huge redirection, and then the foreign affairs, then the other roundtable groups, I'm sure, but particularly the Council on Foreign Relations, is praising China. I mean, that's the ultimate false flag. And I'm not saying it is a full-on false flag, but it just, man, it's something that smells weird there.
Well, and think about France. Yeah, France has that president who used to work for Rothschild, and they had all those yellow vest protesters, and now they get an excuse. So it's almost like all the Bilderberg countries, right?
And there were massive protests in Wuhan, too.
Yeah, there had to be something in Taiwan, too. Taiwan was protesting for their freedom. So there had to be some playbook. And we know they had the DC Strategic Trends Program that projected out decades ahead. And we knew that this decade, there's like a whole bunch of stuff they had written down in those documents about strife, pandemics, weapons of mass destruction. This is like all that stuff wrapped into one. And it's no accident that they've got these MIT quantum tattoos, supposedly funded by Gates Foundation Digital Cash, that's tied in, right? But the MIT tattoo part, that quantum part, I tweeted the patent for it. Like, that's a real thing. So they can like have an invisible tattoo on people to see if they've been vaccinated.
Good Lord.
China passed it December 1st, mandatory vaccinations, before this whole thing even came out. They passed the countrywide law, but I'll leave it there.
Yes, strangely, that fact didn't make it into any of these foreign affairs articles. But what did make it in to one of the ones that I did not cover tonight from the 20th was essentially, the article is entitled or no, I'm sorry, it's not from the 20th, it's from the 23rd. The article is entitled "The Coronavirus Exposed America's Authoritarian Turn." And it very ironically points out how one of the reasons that the Trump administration has failed so badly at dealing with the coronavirus is because Trump's flagrant disregard and dismissal of technocrats and bureaucrats. Like, if only he had listened to more of the bureaucrats and employed a more technocratic model on the United States in his administration, then this wouldn't have gotten to the point that it's getting to. As with a lot of these articles, there's an awful lot of claims being made, very broad, sweeping, general claims. Oh, Trump should have been more technocratic. That would have fixed it. It's like, what do you mean by technocratic? What bureaucrats are you talking about? What technocrats are you talking about? And how exactly would that have helped? Did it help in China? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these things are just sort of stated as a gospel truth. And presumably the readership is just supposed to, feel smart for reading Foreign Affairs and, assume that they're getting the proper narrative. So, oh yeah, Tim's posting up some articles right now in the chat from Foreign Affairs. This is one that I haven't even seen. It must be brand new. China needs bigger government. There you have it, folks. There are a lot of articles about, at least the most recent ones that I've seen, have all used the word technocrat at least once. And I found that to be very interesting because it wasn't a word that was appearing in the earlier ones. But it seems like the more the articles want to deride Donald Trump, the more they will use the word technocrat as a sort of alternative to Trumpism, whatever that might be. Of course, I'm not a Trump fan. I think that that's pretty obvious. But nonetheless, I think that it's a pretty dangerous false dichotomy if you're going to paint Trump as an authoritarian on the one side and then presume that the opposite of Trumpian authoritarianism is technocracy, which is tantamount to freedom, I think is the claim. But that doesn't make much sense to me. We all know that the technocrats are not the beacons of freedom that these articles make them out to be. However, one article that I actually appreciated, and I thought that what it presented was good news. This is the article from the 20th, which is entitled "How Civic Technology Can Help Stop a Pandemic." And it's all about Taiwan. And it's how Taiwan has been dealing with the coronavirus. Now, I don't really know anything about the situation in Taiwan other than what I've read in here, so take it with a grain of salt. But basically, this article paints Taiwan as a sort of third way between the United States, quote unquote, authoritarianism and Chinese technocracy. So it talks about how, the problem in the US is it uses its technology for commercial purposes and surveillance capitalism. And the problem in China is that it uses it for top-down communist state control. But what Taiwan did, obviously they don't put it this way, but when I read the article, it kind of reminded me of what we're doing here. It talked a lot about how in Taiwan, they had a lot of open source technology that people were able to crowdsource information, present relatively freely. I'm sure there were some restrictions, but they were able to present their own ideas and information on how COVID was affecting them, what remedies they might have come across, really just opening it up to the public to deal with and not treating everybody as if they were too stupid to handle a global pandemic and just kind of wait around for the experts to save them. At least the way that this article presents the situation in Taiwan, which, everything coming out of these people's mouths is suspect. So I'm not just going to hop right on, but the way they tell the story anyway, I like it. I like what's going on in Taiwan, if any of this is actually true, simply because it is very similar, I think, to what we're doing here, just putting together a task force and just kind of everyone bringing to the table what they've discovered. It's a very anarchic, in a way of approaching a problem. And ironically, coming right out of the CFR, at least in this author's opinion, that works better than both the American approach and even the Chinese approach. So I'd really recommend, if you just read one article, I would recommend that one because I think it provides a little bit of that refreshing nuance that even though the CFR is an unsavory organization with a lot of dirty history to it, perhaps, just perhaps, every now and then, a decent-minded author might be able to slip some interesting and, in our opinion, or my opinion, good information into their publications. But again, they could just be misrepresenting the whole thing. I don't know. But
Daniel,
yo,
I just wanted to say, yeah, appreciate you doing this. Great job. The latest article, the last one you covered today, what was the date on that one?
the last one that I covered would have been 319.
Okay. Yeah.
And
cool.
let me get you the title of that one.
All right. And the one on the 20th covers Taiwan, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So
I've actually spoken to a few people directly in Taiwan through my classes, but I was just thinking, we have a friend in Taiwan. Remember our buddy Walter Chan, high ticket closer?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'll reach out to him and see what he has to say. I haven't seen him on Discord in a while, but I'm sure he's still around. No harm in reaching out to him, get his point of view on what's going on.
Yeah,
good idea, Chris.
Interesting.
I got to get going. I just wanted to, clarify those two details. I do have some questions in mind, but I'll bring them up later. And in the meantime, everyone, you've probably noticed in the COVID-19, there's a new channel that specifically covers the Council on Foreign Relations. So any revelations or discussions about that can go or can be posted and linked in that channel. And that's pretty much it. I'll talk to you guys later. I got to get going. Daniel, great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you for showing up, Chris. I appreciate it always.
All right. See you.
And anyone who needs a link for the COVID-19 Discord server, you can find it in the Autonomy class chat. Somebody will post it.
Okay. So yeah, just that article that Chris was referencing, the last one that I covered, again, was from the 19th. And honestly, I'm having a real hard time keeping up with the timeline, not of these articles, but of like, all right, what day was it a pandemic? All right, what day did so-and-so die? What day did this happen? Because it just, it seems to be escalating so quickly. And especially since I've been called off of work, it's like it's all just been one long day. It's hard to really keep up with the news as it changes, especially not having that usual routine locked in. So I know that today it was reported that Italy's numbers had dropped to 600 something, but this information is whizzing by so fast. That's the headline I saw, but I don't know what the numbers were at before that. So it's like maintaining perspective in this situation for me is difficult, especially because there are other projects that I'm working on, other projects that I'd rather be working on, that I was working on before this pandemic hit. But now I feel like I should be devoting a lot of attention to this. Not all, but a lot. So I think that kind of leads into the idea of a topic-specific task force, for lack of a better term, in dealing with specific elements that interest you or a group of people, focusing on that, studying that, and presenting on that, and not having to worry about figuring all of the data points out at the same time and creating the whole collage on your own. We've got a lot of people in here, and so I think Igor, please feel free to chime in on this too, because we discussed this together. Just if we could specialize and we could each work to our strengths and pick a subject area that's relevant to COVID that would be useful to creating some sort of long-term presentation or database, whatever it manifests as, that I think would be a really good use of all of our time, especially, for those of us who are self-isolating or whatever they're calling it, that gives you something to do, right? I saw today that Netflix crashed anyway, so what else do you have to do? So,
hey, Danny, thanks for bringing that up. And also, dude, wow, bro, wow, yeah, this is incredible, man. This is awesome. I appreciate you putting this together. So the idea that Danny and I had is like really looking for volunteers to kind of create, like he mentioned, more like a intelligence agency type task force where we all zero in on certain aspects of the what, who, where, when, and why. for this whole thing. And then we have an exercise in basically gathering factual, verifiable, information and data points that we can then all present and possibly preserve into a an understandable report type deal, kind of like doing the counter event 201 exercise. But if you guys
talking like a white paper, output product, because it sounds trivial, but who, what, where, when, why, and how, those are actually complex questions. The where, it depends on the time. And the first report was a guy, Japanese guy in Hawaii in September.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
there's a lot to all these that needs to be fleshed out in those sections. That's a good idea. Are you in charge of that now, Igor?
Thank you for putting me on the spot. Well, I was actually going to say that Council on Foreign Relations channel inside COVID, if we can just volunteer for the name and the topic that interests us, and then how often we can actually contribute to kind of keep each other in integrity and stuff. I will definitely. I feel interested in the research coming out from the front lines on the actual, the disease itself. So I would be willing to freaking scour every single research paper that's published, and kind of report on that as time goes on. So I'll basically type my name in there, and that way we can see who has interest in what, and then we can, kind of, almost like specify and delegate on, when we can get some things done in certain reports. But yeah, I'm down.
I want to point out too that it's bigger than the CFR as well, right? I mean, some of the basic grammar could include what's a virus, how were the previous pandemics reported, and how did they spread, what was the aftermath, how do they test for these things?
So once we find out like a decent number of people are interested and how many subjects we might be dealing with, we can go ahead and create more channels specifically devote to those topics that people can work in. We could just, I think what Igor is saying is just for now.
Somebody's got a hot mic.
Just for now, we can, you could put your name into the CFR chat just so it's all in one place. Everyone knows where to look. And then from there, using that as a kind of home base, we could spread out more channels where people could work exclusively on a given topic. But yes, Luis, to answer your question, what is a virus? What are the fundamentals of this entire thing? That's a very important aspect. And if you would want to do that, by all means, there are so many angles to this that, somebody could look at the origins of it. Somebody could look at the precedents for health false flags in the past, like Operation Dark Winter, for example, things like that.
One could ask, when did they stop tracking SARS and H1N1, swine flu?
And how did they come up with some of those numbers during the pandemic, right? At some point, the confirmed cases were basically presumed cases,
Are they PCRs? Are they post-mortem tests? How do they know? In Italy, they could be lumping in flu deaths, like, as I've heard doctors say, they're not even testing. They're just any death is being counted.
That's exactly what they've done in the past. It was, there was a pandemic going on. You showed up with the sniffles, therefore you had SARS, even though it was chemical exposure and it wasn't even viral, much less SARS or H1N1. So that seems to be par for the course, or at least it has been in the past.
Yeah, and so if we can get a group of people who are really interested in just exploring that aspect of it, and trusting that all the other important and interesting aspects of the whole picture of COVID are being dealt with by another group of people, I think that would lead to heightened productivity, and we could really compose I don't want to say exhaustive, because I don't think anything is truly exhaustive in this world, but we could get pretty damn close to an exhaustive repository of knowledge on this topic. And most importantly, it would be developing as it happens. We wouldn't be working retrospectively. We could be real-time monitoring not only the numbers as they fluctuate or appear to fluctuate, but we could also be monitoring the propaganda that surrounds this event. And one example of those things tying together is online. As I'm sure you've all seen, there are like so-called live COVID update sites where it's just a counter with the death toll rising. It updates every couple seconds, et cetera, et cetera. So I was looking online, and I found at least 3 of those sites, and I opened them all up, and I kept them next to each other, and I made sure to like check when they refresh, and not once did any of the numbers ever match up. And interestingly, not one of those sites actually sourced where these numbers are actually coming from. Where did this
And some of those sites are hacker sites. I posted from the Hacker News a couple days ago on Twitter how they're creating fake sites so that they can access people's data. So the only safe site is the Johns Hopkins medical portal, and I posted it in the COVID chat earlier.
Excellent. Okay, good.
I mean, I'm not saying they're accurate. I'm just saying that's the one that's official.
Okay, well, good to know. Right. It's like, how many people who are just going online and saying, ooh, coronavirus, live updates or deaths. I don't know. I wonder if there's like been a news presentation or announcement that, hey, you know, don't trust this site, or that site. Go to the Johns Hopkins one. All of these sorts of things are what we could be monitoring in a topic-specific task force.
Yeah, I only took it seriously because I subscribe to a couple hacker sites on Twitter to keep abreast of those type of things. So if it was just like a random tweet, I'd pay no attention. But since it was hackers warning other people about it, I was like, okay. Like white hats warning about black hats, I take that into consideration.
Absolutely. You know, a crisis is a good time to make a buck. You could really you could capitalize on people's fear, not only as a government, but as a opportunistic hacker as well, I'm sure. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that there would be cyber looters, for lack of a better term.
Well, then, getting back to the point about the value of the Discord server, I've found it valuable because it's not all bad news being posted in the updates on the COVID. Like I've posted treatment research. I've seen other people post a lot of encouraging stuff on there. So those are the things we're not getting through mainstream media for the most part. And so adding the CFR room to the server for, you know, this specific type of deep dive research is also super useful because it gives people the big picture.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's so important to have a really holistic look at this, because all we're getting from the mainstream and from the people in our lives is, you know, just very focused isn't quite the right word. It's more of just like a frantically small-minded approach. You know, oh, we're all going to die, or oh, it's just the flu, we'll all be fine. There's not a lot of nuance to the consideration of this from what I'm seeing. And I've been listening, at least before I was let off of work, I would listen almost every day to CNN because I was really interested in, like, what are they saying about it? And it was just the same spiel every 20 minutes or so. They would have Sanjay Gupta on every 30 minutes, and he'd say the same thing on every different show. It was not only really boring, but it lacked any shred of nuance. There was no discussion about, you know, well, how accurate are these numbers? And are we going to talk about where this may have really come from? Nothing. It was just, this is really scary. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't have enough masks. We're running out of beds. Commercial. And then repeat. So I think it'd be useful for us to not only create this repository of information, not only for our own use, but I would say if you're interested in taking part in this, think of it as just imagine that it's a project that could be released to the whole world. You know, put yourself in that position where you're doing research that could ostensibly provide somebody with a wealth of information that they would never in a million years get in the mainstream. And any sort of criticism or narrative talking point rather, that they might want to throw at you, that you would essentially have done so much research that you know their argument better than they do. I think that the most important thing in any responsible task force dealing with a topic that's so inflammatory, but also uncertain and important, is holding ourselves to the highest standards of rigor. And I enjoy the fact that I'm surrounded by a group of people who I think are up to that. So it's exciting for me because it's not only an opportunity to just get some real experience researching real time, but it also has the possibility of becoming something very useful to a much, much larger population than just the people in this room.
I think it's a worthwhile endeavor also because the alternative is what, just passively accepting information, just letting it wash over you, So I think it's a productive use of our time, like what does this mean? And does this contradict what was said before? And does this match, what we know about how diseases spread, et cetera? Yeah. So yeah, I was excited when I heard that you were doing this because I thought, yeah, this is good stuff. So
excellent. Yeah. So if you want to throw your name in the CFR chat on the COVID server, we will, once we get some names in, I'm thinking I'll probably type up like a Google Doc, or if anybody knows an alternative, I'd rather not use Google, especially in times such as these. But I'd love to whip up some shareable document that just says, here are all the topics and here are the people who are covering each, just so everybody knows what's being done. And that also will allow for a level of accountability. And we could also, it also would just serve to as like a sort of catalog of what's being worked on, and we could review it every now and then and see what maybe should be added to the list, or if there's a project that's been completed, we could add that to yet another list of like, I don't know, something that could be put out online as just like a completed resource. I don't know.
Do you want to try making an outline for the white paper, and then people can take sections of that, and that might be helpful in delegating or self-delegating for the volunteers?
Yeah, that's okay. So just kind of like list out some of the important topics that I think of, and leaving it open for other people to add to, of course, but just kind of starting with a bare bones model and then letting people go from there. So yeah, I can probably whip that up pretty soon. I've been just kind of writing down different ideas, like, ooh, this would be an interesting topic. This would be an interesting topic. So I could compose all those, and please, if anybody has any suggestions for topics that they would be interested in, or even ones that they wouldn't want to research themselves, but just kind of want to suggest maybe somebody else would be interested, throw them in that Council on Foreign Relations chat in the COVID server, and I'll put it on the list.
and this might even have practical uses too, not just academic, and I'm thinking just in the sense of, the vaccine that they're working on is pretty scary sounding, right? It's some kind of DNA vaccine. I don't know exactly how it works, but that's something I would like to understand a little bit better. If they're going to start manipulating people's genetic code, what does that mean, right?
Yeah, dude, I think I've seen that movie where everyone takes the vaccine, then dies 6 months later, and the Earth is left unpopulated. I think that's a bad movie.
That sounds terrible. Yeah, that's
right. Like, so why are they just pushing this? And they, some of these countries, like Scandinavian countries, have already made it mandatory.
Yeah.
Vaccinations for this once they get it. They don't even have it. They haven't even tested it. They don't know. They don't really care because it's about something else.
Yeah, no, that's the most terrifying thing of all of this is that vaccine. That's what terrifies me the most. And this is like freshman biology, right? So it's hazy and a long time ago. And at the time, I hated the fact that I was made to take it. But like there's some error correcting that goes on in our, like our there's something about how our bodies handle our genetic code. There's some error correcting that's built into it, right? So I'm thinking, oh man, can we protect or shield ourselves from this somehow? If the vaccine can't be avoided, that but I just don't know. I mean, I kind of now wish I'd studied biology.
There is an error correcting code built into damaged cells. That's correct. It's and DNA sequences for those cells. It's also raises the question of Darwinism a little bit, or some of the tenets of Darwin.
Yeah, I like science. I just don't like being a guinea pig.
Yeah, exactly. My whole thing, the vaccine's the thing that scares me the most too, Luis. I agree with that. I'm hoping in America, what I believe they'll do is they won't force it, but they'll make big private companies they'll be the ones to make it mandatory. So if you work in a certain industry, they'll be like, well, now you need the vaccine, the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine or whatever it's called, for that specific viral strain. So that to me is terrifying, but I don't think there'll be a federal sort of law passed about it, or even in states or whatever.
I hope to God you're right. You know, and I really do. I mean, it seems like there's almost always an out, and I don't know why there's almost always an out, and I don't know if it's, you know, something exceptional about the United States or not. I do know that most of my neighbors are terrified. Well, not most, maybe, you know, a good portion of them are terrified. So, you know, they're all sold on the idea of mandatory vaccines.
Right.
But I hope you're right, man.
Yeah.
I'll ride my bike. You know, I'll give up my license. I'll give up my job. You know,
that's what I'm saying. I'll give up my job. We'll self-organize together and find a way to be useful and make money. And that's where I agree, though. I think they're banking on, for in America, just the herd mentality. Everyone's just going to run and get the vaccine because everyone's so scared. And then the way the federal government seems to like to do it is not, because it would be too conspicuous on their level to roll it out and by a law. I think they're going to make private industry. It's like when you go to college or when you go to a specific industry, you work in healthcare, you have to get specific vaccines. I think they're going to do it through that mechanism. So like, oh, if you want to work in healthcare, you're going to have to get this vaccine, or you want to work in this specific industry with all these people in a tight proximity, you have to get this vaccine. But we can still choose not to participate in those industries. It will fortunately maybe hurt our ability to make money or do whatever, or specialize in a certain area we've already specialized in, but at least we still get the choice. Where if it's true what Rich is saying, which I'm sure it is, that the Scandinavian bloc of countries have already decided to make that mandatory before it's even been, and it's also being rushed. I mean, they're saying an 18th month timetable, which I think is going to be 12 months, which is scary. So within a year where they're going to have a vaccine, which means they need to perpetuate it, which also goes to the whole hydroxychloroquine, if that actually does work. And we can argue about viral stuff, but let's say it does work and it's not that toxic. You can see how they're sort of downplaying it a little bit. Maybe not Trump himself, but other people within the task force and the administration. So there's all these angles. I guess it goes back to just having to research.
Yeah, the people who take money from big pharma, because big pharma is the biggest lobby. They're twice as big as big oil. And then you take a step back and you're like, holy shit, they're the same thing. Big oil and big pharma, like pharmaceuticals are made from petrochemicals.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a huge amount of influence, undue influence on our government. Because the lobbyists still have influence instead of the citizens on the government, that's what makes it all very dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. You're right.
And just an important point with regards to that also ties back to the Council on Foreign Relations articles. That last one that Chris was asking about from the 19th, the real pandemic danger is social collapse. Not specifically talking about vaccination, but I think it's still relevant to what you guys are saying. This article talks about how basically soft power is, in today's day and age, vastly superior to hard power. I know I already mentioned that with regards to the US and China, where essentially it's more convenient for the ruling class if we all just go to school and listen to the television and listen to our doctors and go along to get along without them having to resort to violence, because that's the way that our modern system is structured to work. Its focus on social engineering outweighs its focus on, as was Huxley described as the club, right? People learn to love their servitude based on a number of different channels throughout their lives. So just a quick quote here from the article from the 19th. Quote, "If governments have to resort to using paramilitary or military forces to quell, for example, riots or attacks on property, society could begin to disintegrate," unquote. So I'm just thinking of if in the United States they were to say, federally mandate that everybody has to be vaccinated, I would imagine that there would be a couple loud bangs across the country at pretty frequent intervals. So I don't think that kind of plan is feasible. I don't want to say it's not feasible. I don't think that it's preferable to the powers that be. And so to your point, Tony, if they could get away with just, counting on the people's fear to guide them, So you could say, oh, well, the vaccine is the obvious thing to do. That's what's going to.
Yeah, it's about 100 years worth of PR propaganda, war on the population. Edward Bernays and so forth and so on.
Yep.
That's what they're really banking on. Also, the fact we have a constitution now, I know it's been ripped apart 1,000 times, but there's also a lot of lawyers that would also want to get involved, and it could just be really messy, I think, to try to make a federally mandated law. But it's not so messy if private businesses can, they can choose. They have more leverage there, I think. So I could see that being more of a soft law or soft way to implement such a rollout of a vaccine. One, rely on people's fear, but two, then also rely on the private sector and other specific industries in the private sector to sort of force that if you want to work in it. So at least you kind of get the option, but you kind of don't. But you're the one who's making that choice, kind of, even though it's a little bit, kind of.
Right. Yeah, the public-private partnership rears its ugly head yet again. And that's yet another phrase that appears in just about every single one of those CFR articles. Public-private partnerships. That's what we need more of. Public-private partnerships. So that was the whole point of Event 201, right? Public-private partnerships. So
that's what Trump's been doing a lot. I'm not giving props to Trump, but he's bringing the private and public sector together during this pandemic and trying to get supplies, ostensibly get ramp up production of supplies and medical equipment, all that stuff. And it seems good on the surface, but then he also just is a Republican now. Just signed into law the biggest stimulus package in history, this country's history. So I mean, there's also that to put into a context. I mean, there's a lot going on.
All right, Daniel, I got a challenge for you.
Okay.
Great presentation. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and thanks for coming on tonight. What kind of comes to my mind is that we're caught up in this immediate emergency, and there's a bunch of trauma-based mind control and propaganda going on. You saw it on CNN. Every channel's the same. I have a bank at work. When I walk in of 6 televisions, there's MSNBC, CNBC, CNN, Fox, the Weather Channel, ESPN, and a local news station. And without fail, they all have the same story on at the same time with almost the same headline. So to me, that's an obvious sign that things are being manipulated or being propagandized. But I think the challenge for me is with the work that you've done, to step out and step back for a second, because I see that you're chasing the tiger. You got the tiger by the tail. You're chasing. You can't keep up with all the articles, but you consumed a certain amount of information. Can you step back and say, based on that and my knowledge, I can create a range of outcomes in the near term, say the 1 to 3 year, 1 to 3 to 5 year near term range of outcomes. And as we,
I don't know if it's your end or my end, but you just cut out for a few words there.
You froze for a second. Yeah. So there's a range of outcome in the near term, so call it 1 to 3 to 5 years. And as we move forward, those ranges of outcomes become clearer and clearer, and they narrow, and it becomes, the picture gets painted further, but without the thought around what it could be, the range of outcomes, we're just left stuck kind of chasing whatever's happening right now. So my challenge is to project, and I think any intelligence agency is to project the range of outcomes and then which ones we're trending towards, and in that fashion be able to predict what will happen next, and then set ourselves up favorably to either avoid or take advantage of what is going to happen next. And these guys are not rocket scientists. They're very sharp. They've had a lot of experience, but they're stumbling, bumbling government people. And yeah, there's a lot of technocrats, and there's a lot of things coming down that are going to be nasty and bad for us, is what it looks like. But we may be able to outsmart them if we can get ahead of them a little bit. So that's kind of the challenge that I'm thinking about for the group.
They're game theorists, right? I mean, that's sort of what they're doing. They're playing games, and they're trying to come up with multiple different scenarios. So we could do the same thing. It's a fair point. Sorry, go ahead.
I love it. I think that you're right. I mean, that is sort of the point. The point of gathering all this information and putting it together in an organized fashion. The point is to actually affect the future with it in some way. So if we can map out trends and compare this trend to that trend and what's more likely, that I think that's kind of what it's all about. So I think that will be a challenge, like you said. It wouldn't be an easy endeavor because there are so many variables and they're changing every single day, every hour, really. And we don't even know, what the accurate numbers are and all that. So it would be hard. But nonetheless, I think that would be a good goal to strive for, to do our best to project out into the future. What might this look like? And you could look at that from a number of different aspects. You could say, let's project, what do we think that the ultimate casualty number might wind up being if certain conditions are or are not met. That would be one graph. Another graph could be, what's going to happen to the geopolitical positions of the U.S. as related to China? What's going to happen geopolitically when it comes to third world countries? What about Taiwan? All of these things. These are all projections that could be analyzed.
Well, also, I mean, if we think China is the model and their social credit system is the future for us, which I believe it is, then how do we get in front of that trend? And I think Amazon, Facebook, Google, they were all set up and funded over the course of 20 years to become the model for social credit. What is that going to do to us?
I think that's the big question, because like Tony was saying, if the manufacturing is based in the government per se's hands, but if it's instead left to the private sector, then we could see something like Facebook.
There's no difference, though, Danny. That's in fascism. There's no difference between the government and the private sector, really. It's just they're just a mouthpiece.
Insofar as people imagine there to be a difference, I think that it would be more palatable to the average American if the social credit system was rolled out by the so-called private sector, something like Facebook, fun and cuddly, and all your friends are doing it, that sort of thing. So we could seriously see some sort of self-imposed surveillance health-wise. I mean, people are already posting their location to Facebook constantly. People are essentially doing the NSA's work for it. It's amazing those people even get paid at the NSA with the amount of work that the average teenage girl is doing that supposedly it's their job to do. But I could see a foreseeable future where people would be willing to present the same information about themselves, intimate information about themselves, medically, on something like Facebook. Oh, got my vaccine today, that sort of thing. And that could all be filtered into some, social credit algorithm that pairs you with other people and keeps you unpaired from other people. I don't know what it's going to look like, but
or you can only participate when my buddy thinks he works in high technology. He thinks it's going to be our ability to participate within these organizations or these private companies. So like that's just going to tie into our ability to get the goods we need or to source things we need that like are now becoming controlled by a few private players that are intimately tied to the government. And he's not really a conspiracy theorist. He agrees with me. He looks at it just from the technocracy angle only because he's just into technology and he's hyper specialized in that field. But he gives me little pieces of data that I find very interesting. And he's also a big fan of Black Mirror. So he also uses that as a model of what's coming. But there's going to be some tie between social currency, and then our ability to participate in some of these private organizations that we take for granted right now, like Amazon, for example, or any of these bigger JIT supply chains that give us most of what we need day to day.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, to me, it seems like, how there's that thing where, I don't know, just say, for example, like Joe Rogan has Alex Jones on, and the internet loses its mind. How dare you give that man a platform? That's not the idea that it's wrong to give somebody you disagree with intellectually a platform to speak because it runs the risk of brainwashing the susceptible youth or whatever. I could see a future wherein that same argument is used based on people's intimate medical information. you can't have that guy on your show or on your platform or let him use your service because he's not vaccinated. And we don't want to be spreading that example, to the rest of the plebes, that it's acceptable to engage in the agora if you haven't undergone the proper medical rituals that grant you magical permission to join society. That's a rather grim dystopian image, but I don't think it's all that. It's not impossible, and I don't think it's that improbable either.
Well, we're not that far from it.
We're doing it now.
Yeah, I mean, you can't speak out against vaccines, right? I mean, that'll get you banned already from certain places, or
Actually, you could speak out up to about 6 weeks ago, because we protested at the Capitol against mandatory vaccines in Connecticut. And at that time, right before the coronavirus broke out, the World Health Organization had just been caught on camera lying. Specifically, the woman who came out and made the ad campaign that said vaccines are safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective.
Right.
She 3 days later, in a closed meeting in Geneva with the FDA, CDC, National Institutes of Health, all of them right there, said we really need to get the science in place, and we really should have some testing. And the doctors on the front lines are starting to question us. Well, they're not questioning the World Health Organization anymore, are they, sweetheart?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah,
well
it's
played.
a perfect false flag. Yeah, yeah. And what's even more
coincidences.
What's even more disturbing about that
stacks and stacks of coincidences.
Yeah.
Right. No, yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know what percentage of the news people now get from Facebook or these, like you were saying, that these private platforms where they say the First Amendment doesn't apply, shadow banning of people. And I don't know how many YouTube channels have been deleted recently, but it's always interesting to go through my subscription and the channel's no longer available. And it's amazing to me, like the most horrific things you can put up on YouTube and it's not a problem, but certain topics you just can't mention,
One, it even goes further. It goes further than that, because the Gateway Pundit article that had Dr. Gregory Regano on, it had a video interview, and then it had his paper, An Effective Treatment for COVID-19, that he co-authored with Dr. Didier Raoult, who had the 100% effective trial last week, right? So that information's out there. It's published. I clicked the link. I saw the article. I saw the write-up. I saw the paper. But now it's deleted from Google Drive. So when the New York Times is tweeting tonight how it's so sad that New Yorkers are dying in the hospitals waiting for beds, and it's like, well, since the censorship culture wants to take away plausible, effective treatments that those doctors could call upon, yeah, you're left with an unmanageable pandemic. And even if you got your 30,000 respirators, you don't have the doctors that run those respirators, and they're giving people false hope with their plan instead of saying, hey, we don't have a solution for this. Can you guys in the world of research help us out and find something that's going on?
Well, that's the problem. Like, they're actually effective. Like, for example, even with vaccines or hydroxychloroquine, that drug that is proven to be seemingly effective, that's the problem, is that it actually can be effective and be proven to be so. So when when doctors are starting to demand to the CDC and WHO and other health organizations worldwide to provide the science, well, if they really start doing the science behind it, they're going to show that it's not effective or safe. So then it runs counter to their narrative. And so, yeah, they can try to cook the science, which is what they've been doing. But, Del Bigtree and that crowd and others have shown through their lawyers and whatnot that, well, all this supposed science they have isn't really there. And it's just, for various reasons.
And it's an old story, right? Like, I mean, you look at cancer and they literally made it illegal to treat cancer except with these accepted methods that don't treat it very effectively, right? So you have to leave the country and, go to a third world country with third world care, right? That's how I think people perceive it.
Well, it's not even just cancer. Like, there's a doctor in Massachusetts, and he had 100% effective treatment for people who were hooked on opioids. He had 50 clinics opened in Massachusetts. He had the support of teachers, fire departments, police departments, and they shut him down. You can't compete with Big Pharma. Can't be going to help people. Those are their clients. They need that money.
Yeah, I mean, it's also bad because we've been so conditioned over time that we sort of want that as a sort of normie population. So there's a argument that 1984 and Brave New World is sort of 50-50. that there's some overt control measures in place, while at the same time we sort of want those overt control measures in place, then we can say we are conditioned for that, which is probably the case. But still, there's a whole psychological aspect to the human, like the manipulation of the human psyche, that isn't being talked about that much, as well as to how much we're calling for this now, how much we've been sort of conditioned to want these types of solutions only, thinking that this scientific technocracy is the only way to go. It's not so much an indictment against science. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not an indictment against the scientific method, which is just a more refined version of induction. That's all it is, the inductive method. That's it. It's funny. It's just that there have been authorities put in place to sort of filter us one way with the way in which we view evidence and that sort of idea,
and separated us from the scientific method, right? I mean, if people really more understood what it was, they might be able to see through some of these things more, like that's not science, right? The idea that the science is settled is unscientific. Right?
That's right. If anything, usually scientists, and that's why PubMed's interesting, because here's an example. Like I have intestinal permeability. It's called leaky gut colloquially. And I went into just a GI doctor, and the doctor, it was just like a physician's assistant. I got 10 minutes with the dude. I didn't go back after this. And he's like, man, it sounds like what you're describing is intestinal permeability. And I'm like, but I said, literally, you guys don't believe that exists. Literally. And he's like, yeah, you're right. Like, I know right now, like there's so much literature on it, but it has not filtered or permeated our like the allopathic community, so to speak. And I was like, wow, well, that pretty much sums up, well, there's the pharmaceutical companies are driving what can and can't be a disease. And then there's certain prescriptions that can be applied to those diseases for treatment. My mother, who's an RN her entire life, then became a nurse practitioner. When she was transitioning to become a nurse practitioner, it was nothing but studying pharmaceutical drugs. And then when she did become a nurse practitioner, she was wined and dined endlessly by various pharmaceutical companies. All the time. My mom's not the type that likes to go to those events, but she sort of had to, as based on her job, because basically the way in which medical care is given is through only the pharmaceutical drugs that are provided and licensed. She's licensed to only be able to deal with that sort of treatment. So it's just the whole thing it's controlled by a sort of we can call it a scientific elite, but it's not really scientific at all. It's just
it's more like a cult.
It's
I used to wonder why sleep deprivation was such a big part of medical school or their training, because you figured the last thing you want is a doctor that hasn't slept in 24 hours. But I think it was Mark Passio, and so I'm just basing it on him. But that was one of the common threads in cults. Their sleep deprivation is always a big part of it. I don't know if you're more
hazing. Yeah, that's real. Like hazing. I mean, and also just like a Freemasonry. Not to get too in the occult here, but there's a reason why there's a ritualism around these sorts of organizations. It also conditions something about the mind being conditioned to always then have some sort of allegiance to those organizations through the ritualism is a very important aspect. That's the same reason why, just for example, fraternity will use all those hazing methods, and then you see how people for lifetime will just give money to their fraternity they loved back when they were in college. That's a really simple and basic and mundane example, but as they can be scaled out. There's something about, and religions, obviously we can look at all world religions and the rituals and how people still are suspect of those. So it's interesting. I don't know what it is about the human mind and ritualism and conditioning us to be a part of those organizations in a transcendent fashion, as though now the organization stands as the new God, and anything they say or do, we go in line with it. That's a fair point. And then Mark Passio also said, I mean, this gets really out there, but all the Satanists that were head of the pharmaceutical industry, that's out there. I don't want to go too far with that, but I just have him in the back of my head because Rich and I did film him, and I could just remember him saying that both privately and publicly. He's like, I was with some of these people. I know.
Yeah. So. Well, and it's interesting, a lot of that is hard to confirm, but I got to say it is a consistent worldview that so far I haven't found a lot of cracks in,
Yeah, me neither. I agree.
So, yeah.
I haven't really seen much of Mark Passio lately. I've watched, I watched the Natural Law seminar years ago, and what was that one? I think it was Spirituality. Yeah. I enjoyed both of those. But you're right, Tony. I mean, or I think Louis actually said it, that a lot of it is a lot of the claims that he's making because they're so, well, they're from his own experiences, and that's fair. So, I can't deride the guy for that, but it does just follow naturally that makes it difficult to confirm objectively. However, I find myself, whenever I do listen to him, I find myself nodding.
Yeah.
More than not. It's just there's a difficulty in agreeing intuitively with somebody, and not having something tangible, I suppose, or objective to really sink my teeth into, like a point that I could go out and research. Like, what's his source on this? And then I could find that source and confirm it for myself.
I
That's a
agree.
really big thing for me.
I agree. And also, like, he sort of digs some, he got in, not trouble, but like he started believing some things which I think are verifiably false for that reason. He kind of got a lot of the new age community, which is why I did that new age bullshit presentation or whatever. I forget what it was called, something like that. And so there's unfortunately he just has experience being a part of the Church of Satan. So this weird, or the Satanic Church, whatever. By what LeVay or whatever set it up, and so he from his experience, and the thing is, he's a naturally high IQ individual. He went to the University of Penn. You can just hear him talk like he's one of these dudes that's very analytical, but at the same time, you can't. He has some stuff you can verify, but then some stuff that, because he's dealing in the occult, you're dealing with archetypes and symbology and allegories that seem to be universal, but you can interpret them a lot of different ways, not always nefarious. So it's always very difficult to sort of separate the good from the bad, so to speak. And so, I mean, for the most part, I think he got caught up in a sort of new age crowd that wanted him to continue down more of the occult aspect, and he sort of saw that as sort of a mind trap and sort of tried to call it out. But it's sort of it's not so much hard to verify a lot of you can see the patterns from the CFR research you're doing with this whole technocratic control, but he would present it in this very sort of like intuitive, occult, ritualistic, closed door secret society way, which is so hard for us because we're not in that. And like all we can do is go to various texts, various authors. So is Manly P. Hall, that also had like the Secret Destiny of America, but also like there's a good side to that too that makes it very difficult to discern. So it's messy. I agree. That's why I don't really listen to him. I've not paid attention to him much recently. Not because I don't necessarily disagree or agree. I tend to agree with him. Like you said, I tend to be nodding my head, but I choose to go where there's hard facts, even though a lot of times I know there is possibly a deeper aspect to all of this that we might be occulted or just hidden, as he would say.
Right.
Yeah.
But
that's a good point, because it's not as tangible. Like the cybernetics below that philosophy is very tangible.
Exactly.
Cybernetics is like being kicked off by this. All the cybernetics is like feeding into this whole coronavirus pandemic. There's cybernetics and technocracy at every turn in this story. And that's what's not being shown to people. Most people can see like maybe martial law, but they're not seeing like the long-term effects that are deleterious to freedom. Not yet.
Through technology. And that's the key. They're not seeing, because like we openly want that technology. Like there's this weird feedback loop we've been embedded in with, now we need the technology. And what's sad is like, here's an example that makes it so stupidly complex and frustrating. I mean, obviously I'm on the side of everyone here, and I agree with the whole problem with technology and the technocratic grid. But a buddy of mine, he's a cognitive neuroscience at the University of Boulder, Colorado. And he had a friend of his, he likes to hike. He's a big outdoors guy, like Eagle Scout type of dude. A buddy of his went out hiking one night, and like the snowstorm came. Because he had this tracking technology and on his phone, he was saved. His life was literally saved. If he didn't have this, he was going to die no matter what. He got lost, he became disoriented, and he was literally walking in circles. Now they could do the tracking map later on and show how he is literally walking in circles based on the fact he still had his phone. So something as simple as being universally tracked also saves lives sometimes. Now we know literally that there's more negative connotations associated with that technology over time. But there's also these little, tidbits that we have to adhere to, that like they also can be, it's a tool. And
I love the part where the Boston Dynamics robots are going to be used to save people from burning buildings. Like, so they
Right,
always
right.
advertise these things and their most useful thing. Oh, saving
Right,
kids,
exactly.
saving Duracell batteries are here to do. They always do that. But what I don't like is the stuff they don't so much publish to the public that they're doing behind the scenes that really does play into the overall picture, and most people don't see it.
Yeah, and honestly, that's what they're most incentivized for. It's not for saving lives; it's for either destroying or controlling lives in war or in other applications. That's really where the money is going to be made. And so, yeah.
My favorite example is the implantable chips that they're going to use, or I guess they have used to treat depression.
Like Doritos, implantable chips, those could be tasty.
You know, if they, I don't know what effect that might have. They implanted that in your head, but that might also cure depression. That's a gruesome experiment, but maybe we start with rats first.
Maybe.
They already did.
But I did see, like I think it was to treat PTSD. It was going to be computer chip in your brain, and look, these people are no longer depressed. And I'm thinking, yeah, what else can you do with that chip?
That's crazy. Yeah, that's. I mean, honestly, it seems like they want. I mean, people will willingly accept that treatment if they are serious enough in those cases, which is sad and scary enough. But I think the real trick they've done with us is they've convinced us through the free market, quote unquote free market in the private sector, is like, look how cool this technology is and look how fun it is, and then not realizing that we really don't have to stick a microchip up anyone's ass. We already have a tracking device on us at all times, and now everyone needs it universally. Whereas, like, I always laugh. Never my ex-girlfriend when we were dating, she once yelled at me because I had my phone on airplane mode when I was sleeping, and she needed to get a hold of me early in the morning. And she's like, she went apeshit on me, and she was aware of all this stuff, 100% on board with all this. Yet she was so conditioned without her realizing it that, like, that she needed me to always be available through this phone. And I'm like, well, think about it. Like, what did people do when we just had landlines? People survived. We still got by. Like, I don't know. So it sort of put into my mind, like, how much we are conditioned to really accept and almost treat this as a normalcy now, is something that's completely needed. That bothers me a lot.
Well, it's tough too, because like there's been 4 or 5 times in this process of research over the past 2 months that I've been incredulous. So I looked something up. So I remember hearing something a couple weeks ago, and I was incredulous about it, and I was so incredulous that I didn't even look it up till today, because I was like, that's not a thing. That must be conspiracy theory. And it was that they just detected a spike protein in the coronavirus that said HIV sequence had been inserted into it.
I heard that too.
Right. So I heard that, and I was like, that's silly. Those people in India who published that, yeah, they should withdraw that paper. That's cavalier and callous, and that's not good research, right? So today I looked it up. You know who posted it and where it's withdrawn from? Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, the home of eugenics and bioengineering and all this stuff, right? So that's what gave it credibility to me, because in my mind, it was on some crazy Indian conspiracy site or something. But then I saw it came from the people who brought us like Hitler eugenics and stuff and want to rule the world.
That actually just adds to what that Stefan Molyneux, that Harvard researcher, that bioinformatics guy, said. It's like, no, there's literally copying and pasting of the HIV nucleotide into this virus. And I was like, man, he's like, it's not HIV in the classical sense of the retrovirus and what it will do, but it's used to sort of latch on and make
HIV drugs are working on it. The
right.
Used for HIV also are working on this. And so when I yeah, so if you go through my tweets from today, there's a line of thought starting with the earliest tweet going up to whatever the last thing was. And I dug into all these various research papers, like the Journal of Antimicrobial Agents and all these different places. And I highlighted all the stuff. I put red boxes around all the key text. So if you follow that chain of thought through, you'll be way ahead of whatever they're telling people.
And what's scary about all this is they can ostensibly always do this copying and pasting techniques in order to develop these new viruses, because they can just say we're trying to test for new vaccines until it becomes useful for a government or black ops agency or whatever to roll it out on the public, whether it's that severe or not. I mean, obviously some people, very few in the population, but for whatever reason, some people seem to be having horribly acute reactions to this, if such a thing exists in that case. And that's sort of the scare factor problem that comes in, and it's probably because of all this copying and pasting of various viruses that they're like, no, it's just for creating vaccines, it was just an accident, it leaked out of the lab. And it's like, but then you're like, well, China was under pressure from Hong Kong and the protests, and Wuhan, I heard earlier, I didn't know about that.
Here's even more interesting angle is this: because Fort Detrick, America's top bioweapons lab, was closed last August because they were working with bioagents not on their books, not in the database, couldn't be tracked, couldn't be, right?
I read that, yeah.
If they closed that place, did they stop doing the research or did they privatize it? In what countries could they privatize and have labs doing that research in a type of continuity?
100%. And not only that,
Right.
they share this in private companies. They have databases where they just a lot of times will share a lot of this information, which sounds weird, but I mean, there is information sharing going on in some capacity as well. So that's angle to be considered. And yeah, and that also goes back to Daniel, what you were saying earlier about the biological weapons not incentivized, or the incentive is it incentivized or not incentivized. And I was thinking about, oh yeah, it can always just be used for vaccine research, because that's usually what they argue. Oh yeah, this us playing around with these viruses is really ostensibly for vaccine research, when no, it's probably more or less for bioweapons. And that goes, I think, to the very first or second article you were talking about with the CFR about, the various regulations, the 60s or 70s, about not using bioweapons. It's like trying to tell people like not to create a nuclear missile. They're still going to create, that sort of technology.
And there's a long history of this too, right? I mean, they've been putting dog kidney cells in vaccines and monkey cells.
Time to be
monkey,
finished.
Tyler, you got a hot mic.
Give it to Daddy. That's Daddy's phone.
That's what my household sounds like.
5 minutes.
Mike.
So what were you saying there, Luis? That was interesting.
No, I was just saying there's a long history of something along those lines, right? I mean, there's been
mean the
kidney cells in vaccines, and they've been
aborted human fetal tissue.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And cancer viruses, even though it's not clear that they're there's a link there, but they've been sticking the worst things they could come up with in vaccines for a long time.
Okay, but this is brought to you by the people who say we got to wait 18 months for their vaccine, right? They got to shut down the world for 18 months. However, when they give it to children and pregnant moms, they don't double-blind placebo test that stuff, and that's in the legal paperwork from the CDC and all that stuff that Del Bigtree's been suing them for.
Yeah.
He had them by the balls, and they got to get out of jail free card.
Yeah, well, he also had the fact that he was getting some key doctors to, we would like to see the studies on this. We thought there were studies, and now we're seeing that there wasn't what it was marketed to me. It's like,
I mean, hey, Rich, you had mentioned where did the research possibly go? And I was expecting someone to bring up the Harvard University professor who was accused of covering up ties to the Chinese school in the research program, Charles Lieber, who has...
That's one of the stories I've only heard about. I haven't seen it. So do you have details on it? And can you put the link in the chat?
Yes. I'm on my computer, so I can put it on the Discord. But yeah, it's a Fox News.
Yeah, and on the Discord, we never use the Zoom chat for these meetings.
Okay.
Or we sparingly use it. It gets lost after the meeting, so we like to put it in Discord.
Okay, cool. Yeah, but I'm looking at an article right now, and I've heard whispers in my research. I'm just looking at this stuff that he has connections to Bill Gates as well. So that's a very interesting thing, I think, to look into. Charles Lieber, and I'm gonna put the article in the Discord. I just want to throw that in.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is every time I try to disprove these Bill Gates conspiracy theories, I learn a lot more about Bill Gates that I didn't know. Right? That foundation's got a lot of projects they're doing. There's a lot of money going all over the place. And when I heard incredulous, remember I mentioned that a little bit ago? When I heard Benny Wills talk about, Bill Gates and the global war game event 201, and I'm like, oh, come on. Maybe he funded somebody and they funded somebody and then they did that thing. No, dude, their guys are sitting at the table. They're running it. Somebody thought ahead of it and they didn't think to buy extra beds or respirators.
Yeah, they had heads of not only that, but the news outlets, major news outlets, it was very well orchestrated. That's for sure. That's very interesting, though. What's his name? Charles Lieber. I'm going to use that. I'm going to look that up as well.
Also, all of these CEOs leaving companies. What is that? Is that connected to this, and how so? Bezos selling billions of his stock in Amazon. Like you said,
Yeah,
are
a lot
these
of people
what's
don't stock. Politicians, private individual people in the private sector, high up in the private sector. Yeah, they dump stock. Like they definitely have.
Bill Gates and Buffett quietly retired when
Right.
this started.
That's a good point.
I mean, but besides them, like I think I've seen a report of where in the past maybe year, 1,200 CEOs have stepped down from just suddenly. So there's just something again. These are just nothing that's like really super verifiable, but definitely things that are kind of interesting, right? Like what is?
They're not leaving the planet, are they? Because then I'm really going to panic.
Hey, I watched 2012 a little bit ago. I hope not.
Yeah, they're ready for that giant comet to hit. That's what they're waiting for.
I think it would be an interesting research project if somebody would go back and look at the CFR article, the one that's entitled something about national security. Let me pull up the exact title. Yeah, it was one of the earlier ones, I think. Okay, yeah. From March 3rd, Pandemic Disease is a Threat to National Security. That's the one that opens right up by talking about the government drill that was done in January of 2017 regarding a pandemic that is very similar to the pandemic that's going on now. The article doesn't get into much detail on it, but it does say that it's a legal stipulation that the new president has to undergo. So ostensibly, it's conducted by the head of Homeland Security. But I would imagine that you have to have some extra agency contribution in that. I don't know, but I would imagine that some sort of universities or private foundations would have been involved in that, either to fund it, but also to present more realistic simulations of what a pandemic would look like. So it might be interesting to follow up on that and see what this other pandemic drill that took place 2 years before, almost 3 years before Event 201, who was involved in that? What experts was Homeland Security getting their information from to project this theoretical pandemic? It couldn't have just come out of a government organization. There must have been some other involvement. So, unfortunately, the article doesn't name that protocol is called. It doesn't name the legislation, but I can't imagine it would be that difficult to find. So that's just a suggestion of another route that we could take, because that might elucidate, who are some of the players in the long game, who's really been planning on there being a global pandemic for years. I mean, we know it's been talked about for a long time by people like Gates, but how much have they been investing in it? Like as far as drills go, we know about Event 201, but there may be more drills that we've never heard of.
I remember when I used to work with Rich and Lisa in person, we would go over, like, if you give it enough time, what we consider to be false flags in history literally just become history in the history books. And that's sort of the interesting angle to play there. Is like, well, it's a false flag, if it's too close to the current event, but then if it's a long enough history, like we know the sinking of the Lusitania, that's a very simple example. And that was literally a false flag that's sanctioned by history books now. Nah, it's not maybe in like school history books, but if you read some major historians today, they'll actually admit that, yeah, no, that was to bring us into World War I. That's a very simple and basic example. So there's all those different angles to play. So we know there's a history of using, then there's also a history of using drills, war games, exercises, usually around the event when something occurs. You could say it's Jungian synchronicity, or you can say it's pre-planned, or both in that regard. So there's always those angles to consider as well. That it's worth researching. That's for sure. To your point.
Yes, and one way that I like to think about, pretty much, well, this is something that I always have in my back pocket when I'm researching anything, is I'm not so much focused on what the initial intent was. So, like, let's just take, for example, the Lusitania. It's now, of course, it's not even debatable that wasn't a false flag. It obviously was. But just for the sake of argument, let's put ourselves in the position of saying, no, that was a legitimate German attack. The question I would ask is, look, does it really matter what they intended or is what's more important the actual tangible consequence? The consequence played in favor of the administration. It played to the favor of the Woodrow Wilson administration, which
Exactly.
did want to go to war. Another example would be Pearl Harbor or 9/11.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor,
Without
9/11,
even
yeah.
saying that they were false flags, you could just wipe that out of the whole game and just say, well, did it benefit them? That's what really matters, without having to implicate anybody.
And then the ones that failed, like the USS Liberty, which no one ever really knows about or hears about or talks
Right.
about, because that was a failed false flag, seemingly. So that's that angle too, because there's a pattern, in other words, where they try to manipulate history. I forget Karl Rove. There's a quote. It's like, we're the ones who create history, and you just follow suit, or sort of idea. And that's yeah.
We're in charge now.
Yeah.
I don't remember the name of the article, but that's a good one.
But I'm going to pop off. This is a fantastic. You did an unbelievable job. Thank you for putting all that information together and sharing it with us. That was absolutely phenomenal job. And you said something about a blog that has all the COVID-19 CFR. I guess you just post that in the CFR coronavirus, or wherever you're going to post that out, because I would like to check that out, knowing that it's organized.
Right. Yeah, I'll post it right now in the Discord. So
thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm also going to post that one Twitter feed that just shows you some of the technocratic rollout that's happening.
Awesome. Well, thank you, man, for joining. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Awesome. And no, it's great to talk with everyone. And we'll talk soon. So.
All right. Have a good night.
Yep, take care.
See you, man.
You want to wrap it up, Daniel? You want to keep going, man?
What was that, Rich? You cut out.
I said, did you want to wrap it up, or do you want to keep going?
I'm good to keep chatting if you guys want. Yeah, I'm free. I don't have to be up for work. I did want to ask you, Rich, if I noticed that you've been posting episodes of the High Wire in the Discord. Are all of those archived on YouTube, or is there like a website specifically to go to for those?
I only go to the YouTube page for the High Wire, and so far all those episodes are there. And even though they've tried to censor them, they've got them put back up.
Okay. All right. I've ever since this pandemic started, I've been downloading MP4s of pretty much every video I come across. So I use 4K video downloader. I purchased it a few years ago, and it's got this handy option where if you download like 4 videos or something from one channel, it'll just be like, dude, do you want to download the entire channel? It's like, okay. And I just let that go overnight, and by the morning I've got 1,000 videos from one channel. So
yeah, Dell has a stellar research team, and every time he does a live show on Thursday afternoons, I get a text when it goes live because I'm subscribed to his list. And it's always a worthwhile investment of my time.
Yeah, I only managed to catch one quick little clip. One of the ones, I think you were doing a live feed of it, and it was the one where he was talking about them not doing vaccine studies, like specifically with the coronavirus vaccinations, that they were starting the trials, but there were no placebo control groups, and that there was a doctor who was talking about how, just generally speaking, creating vaccinations for coronaviruses is very difficult, and it runs the risk of spreading further and all this stuff. That's all I managed to catch, and I was like, damn, I'm going to have to go back and find this. So if that's still on YouTube, that's fantastic, because I just want to leave all of this for posterity's sake, if nothing else, just in case something goes up. I've got it all on a hard drive.
If you want a real trip, go back to February 2018, and he did an episode on the flu vaccine for people like over 65. And what they do, it's a really interesting episode because he explained what they do is they don't test the new vaccine against the placebo. They test it against the old vaccine. And in that episode, he showed that the new flu vaccine actually was a great deal more effective at killing people who took it. And it was the one adopted.
Whoa. Good Lord. And I mean, I assume he's pulling all of this from like legit medical reports
from
of
their documents. Yeah.
Fuck.
Yeah.
Man, is there anybody out there who is like seriously trying to contest that dude's work or what? Like I would imagine
They
somebody.
can't. When he came to the Capitol here in Connecticut a couple weeks ago, nobody has an argument for the other side. They just have dollars and big checks to give to our so-called elected officials.
Good Lord.
And a lot of very effective marketing, right? So a lot of people, that's all they see, right?
Yeah.
Somebody with a white lab coat of knowledge is telling them to do this, and they don't question it.
And on TV, I've seen TV shows just casually, like while I was at my old pizza shop job, where they're just like, "Oh, you didn't vaccinate your kid, and now he's dying. That's what you get." Like just this constant barrage of soft power conditioning, right?
Mhm.
You're a bad parent if you don't get your kid vaccinated.
Oh yeah.
It's because it circumvents, logic and rational argument. You don't have to present any medical information because everyone's just convinced that vaccines are going to save you from, that flu that you get every year after your vaccine. Yeah, that's what they stopped.
And at some point, what amazes me too is how almost in the open they're operating. I mean, you can convince yourself by reading PubMed that's free and it's available to everybody. If there's enough there to convince yourself that vaccines don't work, and your doctor's not reading it, the doctors that's sitting there telling you to get your shots, and it's right there. It's a lot of it is free anyway. Sometimes all you get is the abstract, but sometimes you actually get the full paper, and you see it's garbage. It's like, I can't believe this is research. They're like MD PhDs, right? And this is what they do for research. What a joke, You tested something for 3 weeks on 10 rats, and it doesn't cause cancer. It's a joke.
It's amazing. I think the only way it works is because we still call democracy in the which I would simply define democracy as government of, by, and for those who can best influence the people. That's kind of the schema that Bernays provided back in 28. And boy, oh boy, was that guy right on. It's same, but he really hit the nail on the head in his book Propaganda, just describing the nature of the beast we call democracy, specifically people's perception that this country, A, is a democracy, and B, that's the best possible alternative. That, as far as governments go, that's the one you want. A democracy, because the people make the government, and as he so succinctly of their minds are molded by groups of men we've never even met. And that's really the thrust of that book, and I think that's a beautiful backdrop for what's occurred in the 20th century and now 21st century. How if you just tell people that what they've got is a democracy, and then the influential psychologists can create not for their agenda, but and aesthetics surrounding their agenda, it's far more efficacious because people will latch on to that sort of ritualistic and group-minded repetition of the agenda without ever being logically convinced and not ever having to truly instead everyone just gets kind of swept up in this cultural wave, and those of us who flail against it wind up on the beach left to dry, unfortunately, just for going against the tide.
Most people, I think, don't have their guard up, and I mean, I didn't either. I was just passively accepting information. I didn't know that I needed to have I think there's a sense that you've got a pretty good read on things, right? And then the thing that I always found curious was, I think there's a general sense that of all the governments, the U.S. government is the one that's not corrupt, right? And proclamations by the Chinese government, or if it's some third world country, it's kind of a Mickey Mouse government, it's corrupt. And so I think that's part of it, right? People just don't know to ask questions, and they get upset, right? If you suggest that maybe there's something, maybe we're being lied to, or manipulated in some way.
Yeah, well, and there's that extra scary implication that if something truly is wrong with the system, then, well, I might have to do something about that. And I think for a lot of people, that's that's where they say, "Yeah, never mind, everything's probably fine," because I don't want to get involved. It's too risky, too dangerous, and I'll sound like a lunatic anyway. So I feel like maybe even unconsciously, that's a reason a lot of people kind of just choose to check out and say, I'm just going to stick to the news and going to McDonald's and going to work, and that'll be my life. Because it's like the idea of admitting that public school is prison or something. It's like, well, with that, you have to kind of admit that, oh shit, well, I've been sending my children to prison. I've been harming my kids. That's a difficult admission for people to make, I would imagine. So instead, you just don't make it, you know?
Yeah, it's hard to be different too, and to go against the grain. So you kind of have to get used to it, I suppose. Or I've gotten used to it.
Yeah, it's an acquired taste, but I think it's worth it. And I think the most troubling thing is in a time like this with a global pandemic is not just like convincing other people to change their minds, but not how do you avoid other people just immediately pigeonholing you because, oh, well, we're in an emergency and you're not reacting the way you're supposed to. Therefore, you're a threat too. Like if I say that the vaccine is a bad idea, on any other day, if there's not a pandemic, that just kind of makes me the weirdo. But if I'm the guy during the pandemic who's saying, don't get the vaccine, I'm a public menace. That's a big difference. So I think, yet another thing that we could be focusing on in the task force would be like, well, how do we mitigate social pariahism, for lack of a better term? Like, how do we deal with the inevitable ostracism and criticism that's going to be coming our way? Because we're going to have to deal with, the cognitive dissonance of the vast majority of people if we're talking about what we're going to talk about. And it'd be useful to have a contingency plan for that. And also, oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, well, and I was just going to add to that something that I've noticed because I'm always kind of probing, and interestingly enough, I've been talking to more people than I normally do because it seems like people are hungry for social interaction since everybody's sequestered. But I seem to, I've picked up on what I think is a general. People are terrified. They're less. They're short-tempered. If I'm talking to a neighbor, it's one thing, and we start talking. But just waiting in line with people, they're freaked out. Maybe I got too close. I didn't respect the 6 feet. And it struck me that these guys, man, it's just so evil, right? Like all the social interaction that normally takes place. A pat on the back, shaking of hands, the pat on the head. I'm thinking, what if you're like a recently divorced dude, so now you're not on Tinder and you're just alone and there's absolutely no physical contact with anybody. I mean, we know that's bad. That's damaging. It's so we're dealing with that on top of everything else, right? So they're going to be angry and the cognitive dissonance and they're depressed and so yeah, in the best of times, I'm not sure. I still haven't figured out the best way to have a conversation regarding vaccines, in the best of times, or even school. That's another one that really triggers people.
Yep.
So yeah, no, absolutely. I remember in the Peace Revolution podcast, there was a group outreach, or it was called something like that. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. That's the question, right? Like, how do you build the long ramps, right? The easy incline for people to kind of come in wherever they're ready. Because I'll tell you, the other thing that surprised me about this is talking to a lot of blue-pilled normies that are, I guess I would normally consider them blue-pilled normies. They're smart people. I work with them. But how concerned they are about the economy, that it's put the whole virus thing into perspective, right? Even before things started getting serious, I remember one guy in the company was like, the only thing that concerns me, honestly, is, I can lock my parents up in a closet, right? If they're at risk, let's just lock up my parents. But the economy, that's real, like that has real consequences too, right? People need to work, people need to eat, what's that going to do? And I've been hearing more of that. So even just with neighbors, that's a concern now. It's like this is like a different reality starting to sink in. So I kind of, I start asking questions, try to get a sense for what they feel it's going to happen and whether they're pro martial law or not martial law. In my very unofficial, unscientific poll, I would say it's like 25% are just gung ho, rooting for martial law and mandatory vaccination, right, to save them. And then the other 3/4 aren't so sure that it's a good idea.
Right. Well, I think, with the vaccination thing, probably more people are skeptical than would admit. I'm just, talk about an unscientific claim. That's just an intuition that I have. More people are skeptical than would like to admit they were skeptical in decent company. However, I don't think that they're fully appreciating the potential health risks. I think for most people, it would more be like, well, I'm skeptical that this will actually work, as opposed to I think that this might actually cause damage to me. So I don't know. I think it would be important for us, if we're going to be doing work on the vaccine and, trying to show that, no, it's not about whether or not it's going to be effective. It's about whether or not it's going to hurt you or hurt your children. That's the priority here. Is it going to make the problem worse? Not just, is it not going to fix it? I think that's a good starting point, because I don't know. I hate to say it, but people really are motivated by their fears. And I don't mean this to say like, oh, we should scare people out of using vaccines in any sort of propagandistic way. It's just, I think it's an unfortunate irony that, all the fear that people have for something like the coronavirus or something like international terrorism or, the Red Scare, all that kind of fear, it seems to just kind of absorb all the other fear that people could be having about other things, like the government shooting you up with chemicals that you can't pronounce and have never heard of, and even your doctor isn't all that familiar with. Like, shouldn't you be afraid of that too? I'm not saying you shouldn't be afraid of the other thing, but shouldn't that also be on your radar? I don't know. It's weird. It's, to get back to like the Mark Passio thing, it's almost as if it's a sort of black magic diversion, right? Like, the virus itself becomes the scapegoat, and so the fear that could have been also spent on hasty, quote unquote, solutions is all mitigated and just redirected to the virus itself, and so people will gladly accept the vaccine.
And when you started that train of thought, I thought of Mark Passio too, but along different lines. And I think other people have said it, but I think I heard it from him first that, what they do is they create a knowledge differential, which translates into a power differential, right? So what we're talking about here is, most people are just honestly pretty ignorant, right? They don't understand that what isn't a vaccine. They don't. And what's interesting? So most people know mercury is bad stuff, right? Like that's bad stuff. You break a thermometer, you got to evacuate the room. So they had to hide the fact that there's mercury in vaccines, right? They call it something else. They call it thimerosal. They tell you that they've removed it from the vaccines, and maybe through some technicality it's been removed, but there's still, mercury in there. And so
it's out of the vaccine and it's in the bottle. So when they put the vaccine in the bottle, it actually is there for when they put the needle in the bottle and put it in you.
Right.
According to Del Bigtree on the High Wire. Again, a superb reference.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's so this like this lack of knowledge, right? It's like people, well, I guess you can call it indoctrination, right? Mark Passio would talk about people starting off as a hole in the ground, right? They're not even they're not even at zero. They're at like something less than zero. And they have to learn their way out of all the wrong things that they learned, and then start getting a basic grammar. So if you understand, okay, so formaldehyde's probably bad for you too, right? So maybe that shouldn't be injected, Or aluminum. Okay, it's safe to cook on, but it's different when it's injected, right? So I think that's kind of the hurdle. That's what we're facing, right? There's so much information that needs to be transmitted, and also I think there's a lack of self. Well, we talk about this often, right? And I know it's part of the richest lectures, but I think that I have noticed that there's kind of a lack of self-esteem that I think people can't feel that they can't figure it out for themselves, right? Like they're presented with the information and it's like, okay, I can see why this sounds like a bad idea, but they can't go against the expert, or disobeying orders,
Yeah, there's this inclination to trust, and
Man, the fact that doctors fire you in this country, right? Like I think that's so ludicrous that you get fired by your doctor. It's like, no, buddy, you work for me, right? But that's what happens, pediatricians fire parents for not vaccinating their children. I mean, that says it all. It's just so ludicrous.
Well, yeah, but that's the situation when the state is, what is it, parens patriae. They're granted the position of the parent legally, and they say that's limited to certain circumstances, but I think we all here understand that that's the default. It's just a matter of how deeply they can express that. But I think the sentiment is universally that we are all the state's children. Plato was talking about that in his Republic 2,500 years ago. I think that it's had long enough to seep into the public unconsciousness, and ever since then, it's been the sort of motivating factor of totalitarians that we are the benevolent guardians of society, and the best citizens are those that are good little boys and girls, and their masters go along what they're told to do, even so far as to sacrifice their own lives, well-beings, and wealth for the state. It's not a new story yet. Walking around, it's as if nobody's ever heard this one before, but it's the story I have. It's volume 5 or volume 6 of a great book. it's and that's over 2,000 years old. So if only more people were familiar with what I can only describe as the nature of coercive power. I don't even want to call it just government, because corporate interests, when given monopolies on force, regardless of whether they're called governments or corporations, these things can be repeated under different guises. So just coercive power itself, it operates under certain parameters. These 9,000 years ago, and public, which everyone really should, the linchpin of that entire societal model was a universal public schooling system that taught, in Socrates or Plato's words, it taught noble lies. So you should really read that and then meditate on institution today. Interestingly, there's a part of the Republic where Socrates talks about public health, and this is a part of the Republic that I really agree with, actually. He says that in the ideal society, the average citizen would just have such a intimate knowledge and deep relationship with the food that they consumed, an understanding of what it meant to be nutritious and physically fit, that it would be no doctors, because everybody would know how to take care of themselves. Unfortunately, that's one element of statecraft that did not carry down to our modern times, and we're left with an entire industry of doctors, as you say, firing parents and giving bunk advice based on unread research papers that don't even have placebo control groups in the studies they're talking about. We're in quite the pickle. That's why.
Along those lines, it always struck me as odd that there's so much confusion as to what a human should eat to be healthy, right? You can find different opinions. Cholesterol's good, cholesterol's bad. There's all this confusion, but for animals in the zoo, they seem to have mapped it out pretty accurately, and to 10 decimal places, they know what animals need. But for us, there's somehow it's been muddled, and maybe that's why that there'd be an explosion of well-being, very easily. But gotta eat the Doritos.
Yes.
And the Coca-Cola and whatever,
It's
and that was the sad thing about watching people load up with groceries at the supermarket, like watching what some people were hoarding. They were going home with it was a shopping cart full of Pop Tarts and soda. And it's like, oh my God, man, really? You're getting ready to eat, 2 months worth of Pop Tarts? I mean, even if it was good for you, I think by the second day, I'd want something else.
Right. Well, that stuff's going to kill you before the coronavirus does.
Yeah. Well, they're planning ahead, I guess.
Yeah. Good Lord. Yeah. So I think it's just incumbent on us, those of us who are interested, those of us who care, and those of us who possess the skills or would just like to develop the skills if we don't yet possess them, to really dig into this very broad, very vague in many ways, and very precipitous event, and divide it up into bite-sized chunks. Everybody picking a subject or getting together with a small group of people and picking a subject and just really hitting it as hard as you can, doing your due diligence, checking out every side, going in with no biases, making something that's truly palatable and presentable to a wide public. I think that we'd be doing a tremendous service to ourselves, developing important skills, and also potentially contributing something to our communities, both locally and globally. And one thing I think it would be great to include in this larger task force would, of course, be our own internal, like, fact-checking team. Like people who go around and make sure, all the work that we're doing is on the up and up, and that nobody missed anything. Like I said before, with any research project that, like, personally anyway, any research project that I'm going to be a part of and that I pursue on my own, I hold myself to the highest standards of rigor, because if you don't do that, then what's the point? So I think that the more of us that are going to be involved with it, the easier it will be to hold each other to those same standards, and the better the product in the end will become. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there, that this project is in no way supposed to just be like an echo chamber that I'm suggesting that we can all just get together and say the conclusions that we want to have about this virus. It should be something that we're all constantly in communication with one another, making sure that we're all hitting every angle that we need to, that, perhaps I missed something, or perhaps I'm thinking about something in a way that neglects certain aspects. We need to hold each other accountable if we're going to take it seriously. But I think ultimately, even though it might sound difficult, it's a tremendous opportunity for all of us to become really good at real-time research. And also, I think it's an exercise in remaining calm when everybody else seems to be panicking. Like that CFR article said, facts are the best remedy to anxiety. We could take a cue from that.
Sure, and for me, I think also practicing the rhetoric side of things. I don't know if this is something common with all of us, but I've been, collecting bits of information and following interests for a long time, but I've never actually organized it to share it, with people, or that's not something I've done enough of. So I think it's a good exercise. What's the point of collecting? And it was at every step, the idea was that I could share it with people, right? But anyway, that's something that I haven't exercised or practiced enough. So I think that's something that I think is, it's worthwhile on many levels. So I'm really glad you did this, and it was an awesome presentation, Daniel. So this was good stuff.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it and got some value out of it. It really kind of came to me as a last minute thing. Just a couple days ago, it's like, oh, let's see what the CFR is talking about, and then here I am a couple days later, having read almost every single article they've written on the subject. So, if the passion grips you, run with it. So, I've enjoyed, believe it or not, I've actually enjoyed reading all these CFR articles and highlighting them and thinking about them and taking notes on, how they're relevant to the larger scenario. Like I said, there's so much in them to cover that it's a difficult task to try to just kind of glaze over it all and do a quick summary, but it's a good skill to develop, to be able to concisely map out something. So I hope in the future, when I do another presentation on the articles that continue to come out, I'll do a little bit better next time and a little bit better the time after that. So that's what it's all about for me. And I'm just glad that I've found something useful to do, aside from all the other work that I plan to get done with this free time off work. I've got a book to finish. I've got some podcasts to work on. So I've certainly got a lot of work to do, but this is a nice little added bonus project. And it makes me feel like I'm really keeping my pulse on current events, which is not something I've ever really done before. I've always just kind of let the news slip by. So I'm kind of enjoying staying in the loop for once.
Most people let the news slip by anyway, man. At least you're applying yourself, trying to think it through, and you're sharing what you're learning with other people. And that's what makes it powerful.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, man. It's true. You're right. People do let the news slip by, even if they are watching it every night. It's like leaving the radio on as background noise. So yeah, I'm happy to be in the loop, and to your point, I'm even more happy to be doing something with this knowledge of being in the loop. So I plan to, once I've gotten through the rest of the CFR articles, I'll probably want to get back to tuning into CNN. That is actually boring. The Council on Foreign Relations articles are kind of enjoyable to read because you feel like you're getting something out. CNN's pretty rough. But I'll get back to that just because I'm really interested in tracking the narratives as they develop. I'm fascinated by propaganda as a broad topic. So I would expect me to be active in the Discord server in the indefinite future, looking at that aspect of things. I haven't exactly decided what specific topic I would like to pursue in this task force, but it'll probably be something along the lines of monitoring narratives. Either that or, what's the military history of this thing's origins. I'm really fascinated by that, but we don't have to get into that right now. But I'm gonna clock out now. But I really appreciate everybody hanging out and joining me in the first place for the presentation. I had a good time. We had a great conversation, and I look forward to talking to all of you guys in the near future.
Rock on. Great meeting, Daniel. Talk to you guys all tomorrow.
All right, see you guys. Good night.
Have a good night.